A Few Scandalous Actions of the Imaginary Party by Tiqqun, from Tiqqun number 1. Quote, not a party, but perhaps a new kind of partisan, who would abandon the classical kinds of agitation to instead make highly exemplary disturbing gestures. End quote, from George Heinen, Prestige of Terror. At the time of writing, the first phase of the critical metaphysician's activity can be considered complete. Its dominant trait was experimentation. In general, we expected nothing to come of our actions except for us alone. It was most often about interrupting the predictable course of behaviors at a selected point in social space-time, of creating situations where the truth of our era would be forced to unveil itself. Such aims are opportunely in accord with our strength and capacities, and like them, we have now been surpassed. Thus our victory or our defeat can't really be measured in the ordinary terms of effectiveness. After all, up to the present we have voluntarily situated ourselves outside of those terms. The situation that the critical metaphysician started from was no less than the bankruptcy of the ensemble of modern political practices. Demonstrations hence have become incapable of demonstrating anything that the spectacle hasn't already said, and from one year to the next have progressively taken on the dimensions of a fastidious ritual, offered as an amusement to the benevolence of the dominant chatter, and to the emissaries of the various city authorities. Strikes, for decades now, have only served the sinister function of punctuating the low water marks of democratic life, and are only good for occasionally stirring up the monochromatic festering of the rotting union system. And so, organized scandal has ended up withdrawing in the face of dominations having liquidated all objective morality, meaning, and effectiveness. From this observation was born the naive hypothesis of the first critical metaphysicians, who considered that if the most modern procedures, properly speaking, were today also the most worn out, it followed logically that the most ancient would also prove the newest. The first consequence drawn from this cursory analysis was a decision to try out the use of sermons, which, as we know, Gramsci devoted more than a little time to over the course of his detention. The first Sermon to the Blooms was thus put on the agenda for the 15th of May, 1998, at 2 p.m. in Sorbonne Square. At the preset time, then, a critical metaphysician, for lack of a pulpit, climbed up on a statue of the pitiful Auguste Comte and began to harangue those present. Well aware of the deafening heights of human sleep that our contemporaries have climbed to in spite of so many slips and falls, we gave a tone of invective to the oration for the majority of its length. Either way, at least, we didn't expect any real awakening to happen. Indeed, it was far from being obtained on that occasion, but we couldn't feel any grief about having been excessively conciliatory or anything, as can be seen from these few extracts. Quote, these gentlemen order you to smile. France Telecom swears to you that it'll make you simply love the year 2000. The SNCF explains politely that you can't act like you're at home when you're on its platforms. Your prime minister orders you to work, and you go without saying a word into this landscape of infamy. You were wrong to think that you were safe from everything in your humid and glacial withdrawal into private life, where the walls drip with muck, and that's how, agglomerated into clusters, overcome with trembling, terrified, baldness scrawny, the phantoms have put you at their mercy. You, the shivering ones, the kneeling ones, the cave dwellers, you the cowards, the frightened slaves. It's time for you to come out of your holes. You are truly sinister. End quote. And, quote, it takes you 80 years to die of the absurdity of an existence where you've ended up confusing subjective life with the banal irony of your caprices. You work, you consume, and between these two unchanging poles of the empire of nothingness, you just wish to be allowed to sleep. You think that's living? We aren't counting on you ever forgiving yourselves for having, to such an extent, and for such a long while, failed to know real life. And we expect you to do that all the less, since this whole society is sworn to never pay for anything but alienation, and lavishly so. The most blinkered among you will then flatter yourselves that they are being reasonable while refraining, of course, from making the humiliating admission that if they think for themselves, it's just that they have been thought for by others. Some will certainly condemn us for being unjust, because after all, they're suffering from the present state of things. They certainly do suffer, but their suffering touches no one and evokes no compassion because they're martyrs of nothing but themselves, which isn't much. The misery that their nullity and finiteness imposes on them is itself null and finite. It's not a human misery, it's an animal's. The most refined among you will condemn the domination and tyranny of a handful of corrupt leaders and wink knowingly. But indeed, your submission is the whole reality of the world of domination. It's not you and the system. It's dictatorship, it's poor people, and it's suicides. It's just you and the system, subjugated, blind, and guilty. We reproach you for your harmlessness." End quote. And then the preaching ended with these words, the consequences of which were immediately felt. Quote, "Show us that you are not the subjects of your actions. But if you are, I hope you die of your indifference." End quote. Unable to refuse such a radiant chance to play the innocent bystander, a good number of passers-by stopped, and hearing what was happening, a few tried to applaud the spectacle. But the weight of the insults they received in response dissuaded them from persisting in their effrontery. Unfortunately, by and large, the spectators weren't gifted with enough of an attention span to be able to listen to a speech much longer than an ad spot. So, quite soon they had to give up trying to use us as entertainment, and went off to listen to some group of failed musicians who, a few meters away, were offering infinite comfort with some music that sounded like a dog food ad. A little while after our sermon, there was a demonstration by some bikers whose pride had been wounded by an odious ministerial decree, which for a few moments blocked Saint Michel Boulevard, and the indifference they were treated to for it was comparatively less sustained. Thus, it seems that among our contemporaries, people are somewhat more sensitive to the noise of motors than to the calls for truth. Indifference, wrote the divine Hello, quote, "is a hatred of a kind all its own, a cold, lasting hatred that hides itself from others and sometimes from itself behind an air of tolerance. Since indifference is never real, it is hatred coupled with a lie." End quote. Later on in his work, Mankind, he added, "Death, indifference, and separation are three synonymous words." Considering 1. All the inexhaustible perseverance the French Philosophy Society, SFP, has shown ever since it has held sway to ensure that dangerous thoughts be put aside until their poisons evaporate. 2. The universal stakes involved in the conflict between our chthonic comrade, Rago, and the president of said society, Bernard Bourgeois. 3. The person of Jean-Francois Rago himself, that raw artist of agitation, who, for the great edification of the centuries, will remain the inventor of the digitist dialectic, and more generally, of a Weltanschauung founded on coupling the principles of high-low poker and projective geometry, which also forms a foundation that, as a perpetual secretary of the Commission for the Repression of Anti-Philosophical Activities, he has made it our duty to uphold in a good number of circumstances, in keeping with the line of the Politburo of the Shitfuckers International, IFM. 4. That said comrade was among us today. 5. That an objectively perfectly random chance gave rise to the SFP having one of their superfluous meetings at the nearby university at 4 p.m. on the Saturday in question. The critical metaphysicians could not, without infringing upon their duties, do otherwise than to support Comrade Rago and second him in the distribution of his tract, "We are not fucking around anymore. Total war on these dogs." Let no one be mistaken. The sympathy we might feel towards Comrade Rago in no way prejudices our agreement with his obligations. Jean-Francois Rago persists in believing that he can infiltrate and undermine the French Communist Party by himself, or with his theoretical positions. This is a man who speaks a totally different language. We feel that the reproduction here of the first paragraph of his tract, as well as the last, gives the readers rather a good idea of its content and spirit. Quote, "What? 30 years and 10 days ago, May 4th, 1968, I was one of the first 7 students to be sent to jail by the de Gaulle regime, when Georges Pompidou was Prime Minister and you, Bernard Bourgeois, were a professor at the Sorbonne and the president of the Board of Admissions at the College of Philosophy. And you think you can oppress me now by threatening me with exclusion from the university because I insulted you? Revolting pig. Pathetic little shit. Count your pellets, cretin, because you're made like a rat. You didn't have to distort the facts. And since you have distorted the facts and have been caught red-handed, of course now you want to try to flail about defending yourself ignorantly. You're just sinking deeper in the shit. You fuck. You're predictable like clockwork, you abortion. But tell me, you filthy bastard, once you'd kick me out, how did you think you're going to make me shut up? I like to piss in your hair part, but you're too low for that. Bernard Bourgeois, you snotty eruption on a termite's anus. Go ahead and hold your head high as long as you can. A surprising clinical case you are. An aberration like you really does belong in one of the formaldehyde jars in the Dupuytren Museum as an archetype of the perfect specimen of a motherfucker. End quote. We note that since then, the sordid maneuvering of the above-mentioned bourgeois worked out for him, because Jean-Francois Rago was indeed suspended from the university for 1 year. By a reflex that points out what they really are, rather well, these gentlemen philosophers, thus having encountered some difficulty making good on their right to speculate innocently, quite naturally called their security guards, and then, faced with the diffuse impotence of the latter, they called the police. Thus could they unrestrainedly free themselves from their mask of vain and pretentious clowning. And although there was already something fishy about anyone with even the slightest illusions about the decrepit state of the university, that grand, tender, warm Freemasonry of useless erudition, it has now become abundantly clear its sleep is the sleep of death. On May 23, 1998, that is exactly 500 years to the day after the good Savonarola was hung and then burnt by his enemies, the odious Roman Curia, and the little oligarchs of Florence, a second sermon was given, interrupting a free party. And from Savonarola's time until now, it's been a constant that domination rarely pardons those who conceive of politics as anything other than a separate sphere of social activity. The project of a politicized rave, a number of collectives were to intervene the same way as us, was not tasteful in the eyes of the Political Intelligence Service, who thought the idea sufficiently seditious to send a few of their piggies out, even starting the day before, to keep people away from the entrance to the quarry where the techno-fest was going to happen. And so the first people to show up, who were in charge of setting up the equipment and smoothing out a rough path down to the party spot, got themselves democratically enforced out of the area. The next ones to come were dissuaded by the example. This kind of episode shows the point where the apparent incoherence of domination on the issue of raves finally fades. Obviously, it's not drugs or techno themselves that they fear, but just the constitution of any kind of infra-spectacular world. Whatever the form, whatever the content. We consider that it would not be superfluous for us to reproduce here the text of the sermon, as it was to be read at the end of the morning on the second day of the rave. Sermon to the ravers. Enough convulsing. It's almost noon and the high tide of chemical drunkenness is slowly stirring to roll back. In ebbing, it has given greater acuity to our perception of the dryness of things. All this sonic commotion, with everyone's nerves crashing against one another, all this streaming of electronic lightning bolts, cracking through time and streaking across space, all the colossal amounts of calories burned off by our bodies shaking, all this is returned to nothingness. Now that the sun is shining and the implacable, calm, triumphant prose of the world besieges you once more, all this agitation is incapable of holding it off for more than one day, and its only function is to cover up for a few hours the immeasurable extent of our aphasia, our unfitness for community. One more time we come out of it all alone, forlorn, and with our clothes reduced to rags by the pandemonium on parade. But above all, we come out of it deaf, because every time a little more of our ability to hear is gone, and that's just fine for those who don't want to hear anything. The cataclysm of decibels, like all the recourse to drugs, just serves to erode, numb, and methodically devastate all our organs of perception, peeling away all the flesh of your sensitivity layer by layer, as you near yourselves like Mithridates to a world made of poisons. Moreover, it's urgent that you be inured to it when it comes to sound, since, as the sod once said, the sensations communicated by the sense of hearing are the most vivid. And so hardly even past the age of adolescence, some of us will already be stricken by tinnitus, that acute buzzing in the ear produced by the ear itself, which makes a person forever incapable of hearing silence, even in the most distant solitary places. And thus they will have lost the most physical of their metaphysical faculties, that of perceiving the nothingness and consequently their own nothingness. Beyond that point, the flow of time is but a more or less rapid process of inner petrification into hard-heartedness, fatigue, and death. And so we come to enjoy the growing violence that is needed to affect us emotionally even a little. And in this sense, we are absolutely modern, because, quote, modern man has obtuse senses. He is subject to perpetual trepidation. He needs brutal excitements, strident sounds, hellish drinks, and short bestial emotions. End quote by Valerie. So we see how these nights are the mere image of the suicidal resignation of these days. The rave is the most imposing form of our leisurely self-punishment, where each of us commune with each other in the jubilatory self-destruction of all. As you can see now, this is a call to desertion. All the tragic truth of the raver comes down to this. What he's looking for he doesn't find, and what he finds is not what he's looking for. And thus he has to coat his brain with ever more fantastic illusions, so that he can remain totally unaware of the abyss that separates what is from what he thinks is. And in the last resort, he drugs himself so as not to die of truth. What the raver is after in the first place is a certain romanticism of illegality, a certain adventure and marginality. In fact, he's entered into a desperate quest after a real exteriority to the total organization of society, an existing place where its laws would be suspended, a space where he could at last abandon himself to what he thinks is his freedom. But in the same way as it's this society that commands the necessity of the phantom of revolt against it, this society dispenses, authorizes, and organizes its own exteriority too. The law also decrees where and when the law will be suspended. The interruption of the program is itself part of the program. These free parties, which aren't really free in any sense of the word, are tolerated in a gracious gesture by the city administration, when it's not the cops themselves that distribute the access maps, or more pleasantly, save the facilities from being overtaken by mudslides, as happened recently at PH4, and so nothing in this illusory space of freedom escapes domination, which undeniably has attained to a remarkable level of sophistication. But this lapse of judgment on the part of the raver would be but a comical rationality, were the reality not exactly the opposite of what he thinks it to be, in its principles and, almost invisibly, at its very heart. Because the rave is today the most precise metaphor that this society has come up with for itself. In both the one and the other, there are just these crowds of puppets, shaking themselves to exhaustion in a sterile chaos, responding mechanically to audio commands given by a handful of invisible technophile operators, who they think are there at their service, and who create nothing. In both the one and the other, what we have is an absolute equality of social atoms to which nothing organic aggregates besides the unreal and booming cacophony of the world, obtained by the submission of the masses to the program. And in both, finally we see the commodity and its hallucinatory universe centrally guaranteeing that people will tolerate the generalized drying out of emotionality, because all commodities are drugs. If in spite of the obvious, the raver clings so dementedly to his blindness, it's only because he must at all costs maintain his illusions about the resolute hostility of power and the furious energy of police repression. Otherwise, he'd be forced to open his eyes to the frightening novelty of the most recent forms of domination, which no longer rest in a palpable outside, simultaneously close by and far away, not in the authoritarian figure of a tyrannical master, but rather in the heart of all the social codes, even the very words we use, and carried in each of our gestures, and in each of our thoughts. However, if he would for just a moment let go of his chimeras, he would have to recognize the revolutionary essence of his quest, because this society's only authentic exteriority is political conspiracy undertaken collectively, aiming to overturn and transfigure the totality of the social world, and move it towards a real, substantial freedom. And that's precisely what domination, which surrounds us so regularly with plainclothes cops, has now confusedly grasped. But the raver is pursuing something different, and that is a certain tribal feeling of community. Whether he's participating in organizing the rave, or if he's just at the rave itself, everything about his life shows a search for a perfect and immediate community where egos will have ceased to comprise obstacles between people. He seeks this so blindly that he's ended up confusing it with the hellish fanaticism of a collective quest for depersonalization, where the artificial and molecular explosion of individuality through chemicals has taken the place of intersubjective development, and where an external negation of the self by the sadistic stomping of machine-like music takes place, and each person slowly erases the lines delimiting his or her singularity. From one confusion to the next, the raver who intended to escape the false community of the commodity and the paranoid separation of corporeal and psychic egos finds no other means of reducing his distance from the other than reducing himself to nothingness. He thus certainly will have no other left, but he won't have any self left either. He'll just remain there at the center of himself, in the lunar landscape of his inner desert, which rushes him along, obsesses him, and stalks him. If he continues down the path of annihilation that people have deliberately directed him down, so as to turn him away from the revolutionary project of producing socially the conditions for a possible, authentic community, he will only make his every moment of lucidity all the more painful. In the end, he will have to choose to abrogate his suffering in one way or another, by regularly ingesting ketamine, for example. For the raver, the cure has always been the same as the disease, and that, at bottom, is the third object of his quest, a certain self-destructive pathos. But since what he's destroying has no value, that self-destruction itself is insignificant. As a kind of suicide, it's pathetic. That act, which was once the most dazzling affirmation of sovereignty, has now been stripped by this world of all its grandeur. People have now found a social function for suicide. It serves domination. This kind of leisure is exactly what the post-industrial society demands, to bury any too flagrant signs of its decomposition beneath striking colors, since it serially produces the kinds of brainless ectoplasms that productivity hypnosis requires. One might even see a sort of overtime work in this kind of leisure where people submit voluntarily to traumas that only make them all the more resistant to the growing hardness of the world and of work. But to put it plainly, we don't believe in this desperate and premeditated pursuit of death at all. Everyone, at a rave, is quite simply behaving in the image of the society as a whole. It self-destructs in the most frenetic unconsciousness, entrusting the repair of the damage done to some hypothetical future technology, ignoring the fact that redemption does not count among technology's competences. Because in the end, the raver is the most contemptuous of people, who doesn't even know how to have any contempt for himself, the last man, who skips along on the now quite cramped surface of the earth, and shrinks everything down to size. He is of a species even more indestructible than the aphid. We invented happiness, he says, and gives a sly wink. A little bit of poison now, here and there, to get yourself some pleasant dreams, and a lot of poison in the end to die pleasantly. Certainly he goes on working, but his work most often is little more than a distraction, and he sees to it that the distraction will be maintained. Quote, "We don't get rich or poor anymore, too boring. Who still wants to govern? Who still wants to obey? Both of these are too boring. No shepherds at all, just one big flock. Everyone wants the same thing, they're all equal. Whoever has other feelings can be put away. They'll fit in perfectly at a madhouse. In the old days, everyone was insane," he says, and gives a sly wink. End quote from Nietzsche. He's prudent, in fact. He doesn't want to spoil his appetite, but there's ice in his laughter. Finally, what the raver seeks is festival. He wants by all means to escape the hopeless mediocrity of alienated everyday life, as it is planned out for him by organized capitalism. In his own way, he is engaged, as were so many others, in the pursuit of a truly lived time, and its agonizing intensity. But in all the apparent chaos of his dancing, we only see the imperious boredom of identical lives, identically uninhabited. The time when he's at raves is no less hollow and empty than the rest of his time is, and it fills his excited consumer passivity only all too imperfectly. And when you watch him thrash about in it, what you're seeing is just absence gnawing away at him from the inside. And these aren't really parties, they're get-togethers. That is, they're additive multitudes of beings gathering in places where a few other people will have the decency to get them to shut up. There, at the rave, there are but the shadows of men who have forgotten what they wanted to forget. Runaways who think they're safe in the folds and recesses of their measly discourseless sensations. The sterile rioters of a chemical happiness stupidly communing in a supermarket hedonism. Because the real festival is none other than revolution, which contains within it the whole tragedy and the whole sovereign conscious of an upside-down world. Whereas the revolution is the being at the highest summit of being, the rave is but the nothingness at the deepest depths of nothingness. This apparent negation of the rest of his existence is really nothing but the custom-built supplement that makes that existence tolerable to the raver, the chimerical abolition of time and consciousness, individuality in the world. All of this is little more than crystallized diarrhea for domesticated pigs. We claim that the energy that's squandered to pure loss and raves should be spent otherwise, and that what we're dealing with here is the end of the world. We've just said a lot of things. It's urgent that they be discussed. On May 21st, 1998, at 8:05 a.m., Kiplon Kinkel, 15 years of age, entered the cafeteria of his high school in Springfield, Oregon, dressed in a beige overcoat and a hat, climbed up on a table and calmly began to fire into the crowd of his little schoolmates gathered there for a school function. At first they thought it was a joke, or a show put on by a candidate for class president, and didn't immediately react. I thought it was all a show. I'd never heard a gunshot before. It was like we were in a movie, remarked Stephanie Quimby, 16 years old. When the first spurts of blood appeared, the high schoolers' torpor came to a sudden end, and, screaming, they rushed to the doors and dove under the tables among the gunshots. A few of them were so petrified they couldn't even move, and stood there incredulously, staring at their executioner. Probably because he looked totally calm, like someone who was doing something quite normal, as one of them recalls. It was only when the young man went to look in his bag to get out his 9mm pistol, since his semi-automatic rifle was out of ammunition, that he was finally tackled by a courageous student. Barely an hour after the events, which left 2 dead and 23 wounded, Kiplon Kinkel lunged a knife at the police officer interrogating him. He had stolen the knife at the police station and hidden it in an inner pants pocket. But there were no victims that time. He was immediately subdued. Upon searching the house, 5 homemade bombs were soon found, which had been set to welcome the police, only one of which actually exploded. They also found the corpses of Kip's father and mother. According to investigators, they had been shot the evening before the massacre. While waiting for his 16th birthday, the suspect was placed in solitary confinement in a juvenile detention center. Because of his suicidal impulses, all solid objects were kept out of his reach, and he was put under constant video surveillance. A report on his behavior was made every 15 minutes, and he was provided with only paper clothes. To this day, nothing has come out to explain the reasons behind this act. Efforts to find an explanation for this tragedy are being made once again. According to Liberation on May 23, 1998, Kiplon Kinkel's professors considered him as an American high schooler like any other, and the school's principal maintained that as far as he could tell, there were no exterior signs of anything like this. As for the murderer's mom and dad, they were unanimously praised by those close to them as model parents, who always made sure at least one of them would be at home when their son was there so as not to leave him there all alone, and who were very imaginative in coming up with things to do to interest their son, often taking walks together and going on family sailing and skiing trips. Their friends described the Kinkel couple as patient but strict, very devoted, loving, attentive, and enthusiastic parents. Like her husband Bill, Faith Kinkel taught Spanish at a nearby university. Passionate about her job, radiant and dynamic, she was as well liked by her colleagues as by her students. Violence was something totally foreign to her approach to life. She always promoted mutual understanding among cultures through education, communication, and travel. Kip's father, a distinguished tennis player, had tried to get his son into the sport, but he never really caught on to it. He was a loner, a timid child, small and slight, who clowned around in class to get attention. It must indeed be admitted that Kip Kinkel was a problem child, not just because he rejected any kind of authority, as Barry Kessinger, Bill Kinkel's friend and tennis partner, but above all, because of his inexplicable fascination with destruction. No one knew where it came from, and it never ceased to grow within him, in spite of his being on Prozac. His friend, Aaron Keeney, 14 years old, had stopped hanging out with him as much recently because he started doing strange things. It seems that Kiplon Kinkel had a dark side. We have various corroborating evidence about this. He dressed in black, and he used to brag about having dismembered his cat and blown up a cow. He often put little bombs in people's mailboxes, and used to like to throw stones at passing cars from overpasses. The evening before, he'd wrapped his neighbor's house in toilet paper. His schoolmates had voted him the student most likely to set off the Third World War. Two of his classmates, Walter Fix and Sean Davidson, even said that he'd shown them a black list of enemies one day, which he kept in a folder in his desk. And so, when it was his turn in literature class to read from his personal diary, he stood up on the podium and in a controlled voice revealed to the class his plans to kill everybody. Everyone laughed at him because we thought he was kidding, recalls Jeffrey Anderson, 15 years old. It was in that same school semester, moreover, that he'd done a detailed, serious expose in Spanish class about how to make a homemade bomb, even illustrating it with a drawing of his own where he could see how to attach an explosive charge to a clock. He spent most of his time in class talking about weapons and blowing stuff up, says Sarah Keeler, 18 years old, his neighbor. He'd tell you just like that about how he wanted to kill stuff. I think he just likes how it feels to kill things. He was obsessed with weapons, bombs, and anarchy, said his friend Jeff Anderson. At his 15th birthday party, he'd offered Jeff a tool for breaking into cars, and then gone and painted the word kill in whipped cream on the driveway leading to his house. Jeff's mother didn't appreciate these little jokes much, and she forbade him to ever come to her house again. The day before his bloody rampage, Kip Kinkel had been suspended for having brought a gun to school. His father had then called the Oregon National Guard to sign his son up for their youth program. It goes without saying, with the mysterious proliferation of motiveless massacres perpetuated by children, Kip Kinkel was the 5th case in 1 year in the United States alone. School killings have now taken a real ritual aspect. They've come to compete with the profession of postal employee, so infamous for these kinds of tragedies that it's even used as a generic term to designate them, going postal, and have given rise to a good number of debates, which always have a certain fundamental aspect in common. Should gun ownership be prohibited? Should the age of criminal responsibility be lowered? Should the death penalty age be lowered? Have we entered into a new culture of violence where children can no longer distinguish between reality and fiction? Why are we so reticent to recognize the ever-growing evidence that when children kill, it's most often the result of a brain dysfunction? In such conditions as these, how can we not be afraid of our own children? Should we double bolt our bedroom doors at night before we go to sleep? What kinds of hints could parents look for to indicate that their child could be a natural-born killer? What's left to do with them when antipsychotic drugs and behaviorist techniques aren't enough anymore? Do they have to be put in cages, be given injections? Unable to tolerate any longer the inept blather of those ideologues of capitalism's next modernization process, the Negrius, on June 15, 1998, the critical metaphysicians sabotaged their monthly seminar. By our use here of the word Negrius, we aren't just talking about that handful of morons that came to Paris to hear the official interpreters of their imprisoned master's pomposity, nor even just those who more generally consider themselves close to the thinking of Tony Negri. By Negriism, we are referring to all the whole pseudo-leftist, post-workerist, para-autonomous nebula of those who, since they've now grown old and currently occupy a slightly envied position in society, would like to believe that capitalism can still be revolutionary, and that therefore all they have to do is earn their living as employees, community militants, or artists in order to advance the communist cause. Moreover, it's his way of still preserving his heroic vision for himself as a dragon rider. The expression is his, even in the most ordinary and banal situations, even in the depths of the most notorious servitude. that lets one recognize the Negriist. So in his nullity, he'll never fail to quote Spinoza, Leopardi, Deleuze, Marx, the flattest parts of Marx that is, Foucault, from whom he'll only retain what's accessible to him, and which he can't really even understand, the old senile Gores, and even a hint of situationism. Indeed, if the Negriists could ever manage to discover the existence of the concept of contradiction, they'd have to abandon their sole ambition, which is to critique capitalism without critiquing its categories. But such a possibility is not to be feared among those slobberers, who can't help but be profoundly fascinated by the commodity's faculty for subsumption. Nothing touches the Negriist emotionally so much as the parable of Apple Corp., since it shows that people like him, cagey left as parasites, can become millionaires and even sit on the board of directors of a multinational corporation without ever renouncing their penchant for posing as revolutionaries and champions of freedom. In any case, if he's allowed to talk theory, he'll always limit himself to describe the contemporary mutations of the capitalist mode of production, while religiously cleaning out of it even the slightest trace of the negative. Thus, a Negriist can deliver dissertations all day long about affect value, free labor, precarious hipsters, inflationist biopolitical entrepreneurs, subjective capital, machine brains, cyber resistance, existence wages, or putting emotions to work, and do it without even the slightest touch of irony. The Negriist biased unilaterality makes his discourse easily recognizable. It's supposed to compensate, comically, for the frustrated reality he's condemned to by his refusal to take the negative into account. It's not rare to find in Negri himself that dense pedantic gabble of university professor Logorrhea that Deleuze and Guattari have left us the most undying examples of. Thus we can read from his pen, in number 42, so early, of Future Anterior, such lightning bolts as this: expansivity in all the directions of effect exhibits the moment that transvalues its concept, even so far as to make it able to sustain the shock of the postmodern. Well, how about that? As for their utopia, because these people are utopians, the utopians of capital, it consists in the fine hope that when the world has in every way become a gigantic supermarket, there will be no more cash registers. It's this aspiration to a kind of commodity communism that allows the Negriist to applaud every new bit of progress made by capitalism in the chorus with all the other assholes, while reserving the sovereign right to do it with a sly wink. The Benetton ideology offers a spontaneously repugnant example of this manner of delivering oneself over to the existing order of things with hands and feet tied, and still putting on airs of intelligence. In spite of all our efforts in this direction, we've been unable to separate out what's just naivety and what's just opportunism in all these aberrations, unless it's all just plain stupidity. It seems in effect that the Negriists are incapable of conceiving that we don't just want to live in a world without cash registers, but one without commodities too. Faced with the progress of Negriism diffused throughout the pseudo-contestation milieus, primarily within AC, and with the upcoming launch of the Negriist meteorology magazine, Alice, the critical metaphysicians decide to make these worms know the fate they've got coming to them. A poem for 4 voices was therefore recorded, with very nice lecherous wordplay, such as the ecstatic Trilili, accompany the howling out of our hydrocephalic friends' most fetishized concepts, all over a background voice chattering in Negriish. No one was surprised that our ferocious little revolutionaries were gathering in the Protestant Students' Hall. Not much changes, apparently. In Paris, right in the middle of a famously red neighborhood, the 6th arrondissement. Upon arriving, we found a little social climber from said magazine in the middle of entertaining them with all his defecations. These specters of theory proved worthy of themselves in practice, because they didn't manage even to come together enough to stop us from playing our tape recording, or even responding to our insults. In the end, they sat there frozen with fear at the red-hot cast-iron voice of Comrade Ragot. Thus, it is our glorious duty to report the death of his newborn Negriist group. We'll take care of informing the victims' families. The psychiatrist found nothing to explain the act of 23-year-old Alain on Father's Day when he coldly killed his father and shot his mother. Marius Aurier, 51 years old, a model employee at the SNCF, never saw who killed him on Sunday, the 18th of June 1995, Father's Day, and the only gift given him by his only son was an 8mm bullet in the neck, fired point blank. Alain Aurier is 25 years old now, but he doesn't like to talk about that story. When asked by the president of the Créteil Criminal Court, he responds, "I have told this story 50 times, both to the police and the judges. It's the past. Talking about it won't bring anyone back." But President Yves Cornelou insists. Visibly infuriated, the young man consents to giving a short summary again, and he tells with a scornful grin, "I'd taken a pill of ecstasy at some friend's house, and I hadn't gotten much sleep. My dad woke me up. We didn't argue about it or anything, nothing special. I went up behind him. He was watching TV and didn't hear me coming. I fired. Then my dad was dead. That's all." Yves Cornelou gets angry. "Your father isn't dead, you killed him." "Yeah, same thing." "No, it's not the same thing at all." "All right, fine. I killed my father, that's it." Francois, his mother, who survived it all, comes up to the bar to tell about her son's sudden explosion of hate and violence. Her voice shows no rancor or anger, just an immense sadness. Around 1 o'clock, Marius and I had finished preparing our meal. My husband went to wake up Alain, who was still asleep in his room. At the time, his being woken up at any time whatsoever was always a subject for arguments. So was Alain's refusal to work. The evening before, the boy had told his friends, "Man, I'm sick of my parents always hassling me to get a job." But since June 18th is a day off, the couple weren't thinking about such things. In their small living room loaded with rustic furniture, Marius and Francois had even opened up a bottle of champagne. When Alain went into the room, he found his parents sitting there holding their glasses. "Oh yeah, that's right. It's Father's Day. Happy Father's Day, Dad," he said. His father offers a toast to him. Alain refuses. It just so happens that he's on it fast. Since the whole family's there, Francois invites Marius and Alain to go into the dining room, and she goes into the kitchen to fetch some snails. When I came back, Alain pointed a revolver at me. I thought it was a toy, and then I saw my husband slumped over the table, his bleeding head lying in the leftovers. I approached him. He really didn't grasp what was happening, and then Alain hit me in the face with the butt of the gun and knocked me down. "My son," I asked, "what's got into you?" The reply froze her in fear. "There's no more son. You're going to suffer. I'm not acting out of sentiment anymore." Then Alain Aurier shot his mother, but the gun, a smuggled pellet pistol, didn't work. He pulled the trigger a dozen times with no effect. He opened the barrel and aimed again. I put my hand in front of my eyes, and then a shot went off. Francois went on. Everything went black. I felt like I was dying, and I was so angry because I couldn't help my husband. The shot Alain fired passed through his mother's hand before lodging itself in her forehead. When she opened her eyes again, Alain had put music on and poured himself a glass of Veuve Clicquot. "Things are going to change around here. I'm the boss around here now." Francois tried to get up. I thought I was dreaming, but he said, "What, you want another one?" and fired again. This shot only grazed Francois. Alain stood up, hands in his pockets, and his body hunched over and said, "I want a bitch. See, so you're going to be my bitch now." Having made this declaration, Alain left, leaving his mother for dead. He spent 2 days wandering around the Vitry-sur-Seine area, then hit up the Vincennes forest area. He was arrested by the police a few steps away. Neither the 2 days full of debate nor the reports from all the experts were able to explain Alain Aurier's act. The psychiatrist talked about him having an Oedipus complex, but no one could explain the action itself. It was an enigma, said one of them. Others suggested he was too spoiled a kid, blamed a suffocating climate, a scant environment, and authoritarian upbringing. Just like Marius, the railway man, Francois, the daughter of a peace officer and an accountant at the same corporation since 1972, had dreamed of having a child that would share the same faith in her fundamental values, honesty and hard work. But even early on, Alain, an adorable, very well-behaved child, would just sit there looking out his window with envy at his friends playing in the courtyard in front of the building. I had lots of toys, but always stayed cooped up. Later, in spite of the private schooling, scooter, and car offered him by his mother, the adolescent Alain went off this all too straight and narrow track. When I was 9 years old, I dreamed that if it weren't for my parents, I could conquer the world, he wrote as an adolescent. Except that he was never brave enough to just leave the familial cocoon. He even went in for a test to be a TGV driver. He alone was accepted out of 500 candidates. We were in heaven, said Francois, but for Elaine, work and authority were just annoying stuff. After 5 days professional training, he quit the job. And the tragedy happened not long after that. For the past 3 years, Francois has visited the prison every other month. She brings him money and clothes. She started making visits as soon as she was able to move about again. No matter what he did, I can't abandon him. He's still my son, she told the court. The mother and her son write long letters to one another. Francois's letters are really beautiful, simple, and poignant. Without the slightest affectation, she tries to explain her suffering to her son, and how she misses her husband, the man she loved. She wants Elaine to understand that he still is, and will always be, his murdered father's son. Elaine responds that he thinks he'll come back to live with her when he's free in their little apartment in Vitry-sur-Seine. We can't be separated, we're family. Francois trembles with fear at such prospects. When Maurice Papon was free at the beginning of the Bordeaux trial, she phoned her lawyer in panic. Could it be possible that Elaine might get the same treatment? However, the 3 psychiatrists agreed on one point at least. They found no trace of any mental illness in Elaine Aurier. They can't even find the slightest sign of any psychotic episode having taken place at the moment of his deed. One of them, because he had to report something, put forth the hypothesis that Elaine was in a hypnopompic state. In other words, an incomplete awakeness in a twilight state, which received only a polite skepticism from the magistrates. On June 1st, the attorney for the prosecution, Marie-Dominique Trabet, requested 20 years imprisonment for this egocentric little pickup artist, this big narcissist who can't stand anyone resisting him. And after 3 hours of debate, the jury passed that sentence. On June 19, 1998, a handful of critical metaphysicians publicly humiliated the young and effervescent Laurent Gutman, who, with his complacent theatrical direction, had dared to transform Calderon's metaphysical masterwork, Life is a Dream, into a hipster boulevard theater show. The fact that his Pygmalion had just been rebuked and gotten told to look out, or else one day he and his peers will be strung up for lack of profundity, didn't prevent the lead actor in this buffoonish play from proving us right and admitting that he'd been taken advantage of. And so yapping horrors of both sexes there that day, mostly from the cultural milieus, got to experience true silence, probably for the first time in their lives. They don't have to worry, they'll get plenty more chances. On Sunday, July 12th, on the fringes of the International Summit of Critical Metaphysicians at Arcachon, SIMCA, the motion to politicize the beach was adopted. A banner to such effect was thus painted, reading, "You're going to die, and your mediocre vacations can't do anything about it." And so, in the afternoon of that same day, at the time of the biggest crowds, the critical metaphysicians marched many hundreds of meters down the whole length of the beach, called Pereire, carrying said banner. If the sun can now be stared directly into, thanks to advances in the optics industry, it appears that such is not always the case with death, as the reactions of the beachgoers proved. The operation was a complete success. It revealed all the unimaginable disquiet hidden beneath the whole seaside meat rack. One sunbather thus came and asked us why he was going to die, and another inquired of us what he was going to die of. A third, certainly more familiar with the art of clairvoyance than the first little Heidegger, even tried to get us to tell him when he was going to die. At last one, clearly under the illusion that we were his peers, pushed the envelope of perceptiveness by observing, "Oh yeah, you guys, you sure are positive about life." All the same, the 8-year-old kid that replied to his little brother, who was traumatized with this singular manifestation, "Ah, forget it, those guys are nuts," and the old bearded fisherman, who asked in a loud voice with a knowingly exaggerated Gascony accent, "What, you think they're from around here?" show at the very least a slight degree of dereliction of duty. Cases of poisoning proliferating in Japan. Tokyo, a 58-year-old Japanese man was found dead Monday, August 31st, after having drunk from a can of tea containing a poison that same day. reported a police spokesman on Thursday, September 3rd. This death is part of an increasing spread of poisoning cases in Japan. On Tuesday, the manager of a supermarket in Suzuka, in the center of the country, spat out some canned tea because it tasted so bitter. Police later found traces of cyanide in the can. On Wednesday, a taxi driver drank from a can containing a pesticide in Koryu. 4 people died in July after eating a plate of curry containing arsenic. And at the end of August, a person unknown sent bottles of disinfectant labeled as a weight loss drink to 23 students at a school. Faced with the spectacle of so many bitter calumnies, so many predictable machinations, so many misunderstandings maintained on purpose, we feel it necessary to make public what was probably the first ever honest critique of the Bordeauxian imposture. We got our chance when one of the critical metaphysicians was invited, with near total contempt, to participate in the Second International Marx Congress, and speak to the impertinent theme, daring to research critically. None of them obviously would have ever consented to make such a grotesque engagement. Everyone knows the role the Communist Party has in organizing these kinds of buffooneries. If the other puppets that had been invited to pontificate hadn't been 2 editors of the December of the French Intellectuals, published in the collection Liber Reasons to Act, under the perturbant eye of the much-worshipped Bordeaux himself, the decision was thus made to accept the invitation for Thursday, October 1st, 1998, on the grounds of Nanterre University, Building L, at 2 p.m. But the subject of the presentation was not explicitly clarified. When the day arrived, a sudden attack of courtesy permitted the critical metaphysician to let the 2 dismal doctors of sociology go first to enumerate their ordered list of complaints about the university, which so contemptuously deigns to give audience to critical researchers, and in so doing slows the progress of the sociological sciences, whose marble-white objectivity is sacrificed so scandalously in futile political arguments, etc. Once his turn had come at last, after so many terrifying platitudes, he delivered his contribution to the debate. It began like this, quote, "It must be considered one of the most singular manifestations of the present phase of domination that under the auspices of a party in a position of power, a handful of state employees have publicly gathered here today with the otherwise quite healthy concern of daring to do research critically. In other times, this might have been taken as a kind of provocation, or at least as showing some spirit. But since then, domination has effectively adjudged to itself the monopoly on critique, that is, the inalienable right to denounce its failings and jeopardize itself, because that jeopardy is precisely the permanent state of emergency that it needs in order to force general consent to the proliferation of its diktats. It's now considered extremely rude to not ask a worm-eaten social organization for its permission before demolishing it. But the extreme insolence with which the society speaks of its vices is in no way a sign that it's all-powerful. It's just part of the final phase of its decomposition." End of quote. One of the first paragraphs drew upon the death certificate of the university. Quote, "That the right to critique is a privilege only enjoyed by the powerful is as true in the university as it is in the rest of the society. But that's hardly a significant scandal. It's no less absurd to want to reform the university than it is to intend to destroy it. Because within the heart of nihilism, there is no true teaching or even any real technique possible anymore. The conclusion went as follows. All in all, the decline of the university and the disappearance of the student subject are but minor details within a much more titanic process, the decomposition of commodity society." End of quote. A second paragraph gave an easily recognizable analysis of the function of Bordeaux and his peers in the disaster economy. Quote, "The role of the intellectual within this movement, a movement which domination tends to freeze, must be measured in exactly inverse proportions. The intellectual strategic importance cannot be overestimated, and that's all the more true if you take that as a critique. The intellectual certainly does in essence have a repressive social function. We say that as long as there are intellectuals, that is, as long as contestation, thought, and knowledge are seen as specialized, and not general activities of mankind, there will be no intelligence. And when at last, the artificially prolonged survival of an evil and expired social order has been entirely stripped of its aptitude for rendering the gangrene consuming it invisible, that is, for preserving in the new reality the appearance of the old reality, the intellectual then finally ends up having a kind of power, even in all the powerlessness that he's agreed to. A power that many people, especially those who sign up to get doctorates in sociology, even envy him for. The monstrous media inflation must also, in the same way, be considered connected to the absolute need, even beyond simple denial as imposed on him by everyday experience. To maintain the commodity mode of disclosure in all the categories it commands, usefulness, work, property, value, exchange, interest, etc., all these patched together concepts, now so obviously unfit for use in understanding anything really experienced by anyone, which do no more than render it unintelligible, must be maintained, kept up, and recycled at all costs by the intellectuals, naturally with the use of an ever more aberrant range of terminology, which brings the more scrupulous among them to talk, for example, about such things as a calculus of impartiality, which is certainly no small thing. The critical intellectual ensures a fine-tuned production of clear consciences. Simply by his long-winded existence, moreover, he reminds his listeners of the necessity of scientific analysis, the reasonable reform of everything, and the categorical imperative of dialogue. That is, of everyone's duty to express themselves in the only language domination understands, its own. It is not all paradoxical that the critical intellectual is the most useful objective ally of domination precisely where he is the most critical. It is, for instance, by attacking market journalism that he most effectively maintains the illusion that there can be such a thing as good journalism, and by stigmatizing the state nobility that he implicitly permits people to talk of states without immediately implying their equation with enslavement. Even when there's no other real critique in the closed universe of discourse, besides practical critique, besides the most naked violence, even when critique unquestionably implies just absolute hostility and foreignness to the world of the commodity, the critical intellectual still puts forth his dreary considerations about symbolic domination. And it is at this point that he unfailingly goes back over to the other side of the society, in the dedication he puts into totally emptying the realm of the politically sayable of the unsayable. The infinite does not fall within his field of study, which only comprehends the determined and given. According to him, it doesn't exist. And having said that, he thinks the last word has been said. Anguish, passion, suffering, freedom, destruction, and more generally, all the manifestations of human negativity are among the various things that he consciously works to hold back at the gates of publicity. Just like Junger's dominant type characters, the social sciences live ceaselessly with a terrifying idea that not just a few isolated individuals, but whole masses might one day cease to be afraid of them. That would mean their certain downfall. This is also the reason for the rage against all doctrines of transcendence. Those kinds of ideas, after all, hide the supreme threat, that men might lose their fear. There are certain places in the university where the mere word metaphysics is hounded like heresy, and so the social sciences assiduously work to keep man stuck within the shattered horizons of his finiteness, his scattered understanding, his mortal remains, and his miserable limitations. It's impossible to imagine an institution where just to preserve it for the sake of preserving it would be of any value, wrote Lucas. But it is the society as a whole that can no longer justify its being preserved for any other reason than for the simple fact that it exists, aside, perhaps, from its remarkable way of portraying itself so clearly in every one of its perversions. Its nothingness calls for its destruction more distinctly each day. That's why the critical researcher needs to do his research. Because what needs to be critiqued, i.e. pulverized, is so blindingly obvious that it takes years and years of schooling to not see it. End quote. Up to this point, the audience's only reaction to the content of the speech, and its somewhat martial tone, was one of extreme atmospheric tension. After all, there was little chance that even a singular future critical metaphysician might have happened to have been astray among so many brains so eager to have the French Communist Party indulge them. But it was the end of the lecture that brought the tension to its peak, which among certain spectators was signaled by a clearly recognizable hiccup-like hysterical snickering, and in fact the text's conclusion could hardly have let any doubts persist about our intentions. Quote, but for the time being, critique only makes for doctorates in sociology, and on all fronts everyone agrees to just let them starve to death among the dried-up teats of their science. Because what critique needs now is poets and theologians, not conscientious functionaries of social intelligence. Indeed, it has no more immediate enemy than this ever all-knowing sociology, which works so hard to make the disturbing familiar, with all the unbelievable patience that mediocrity can be capable of. And so we'll have to leave the critical researchers in their miserable lamentations about the precariousness of their professional positions, and about how weak the resources the enemy allocates to them to make their dissertations about it are. All those who can't bring themselves to abandon the ship when it's already so obviously sinking, just because, even as it's being swallowed up, they esteem their careers more highly than the perilous freedom of the partisan, tie their fates to that of a world that's doomed. Their mediocre yet detailed indignation gets no more than contempt from everyone. No one's about to follow them, and no one's even about to like them. Because they critique domination in terms that even domination itself isn't averse to using, they'll most likely end up facing the same firing squads as all those who, to the bitter end, they remain merely the fault-finding accomplices of. Whatever happens, they've no longer been keeping up with the times. Sociology is dead. We won't have any good memories of it. End quote. To finish it off, a codicil is uttered. Quote, in spite of what one might have hastily concluded from the official documents of this Congress, Marx is the man that wrote that, in order to pardon itself its sins, humanity only needs to recognize them as such. End quote. Reduced to their primordial nothingness, and incapable of citing any of the master's books in his own defense, nor any of the books in his collection, we don't expect to see any expression of resentment on the part of the comic buffoon Bourdieu towards critical metaphysics before at least 2002. The biggest big-shot doctor of sociology of the doctors of sociology there tried to act like the whole thing was just some kind of joke, but he quickly realized that it was certainly no joke, when the crowd, having nervously applauded the intervention, attacked him without the slightest regard. In a cruel irony, he happened to be a kind of post-Marxist Confucianist whose speech was dependent on the newspaper Le Monde Diplomatique, and was forced by the virulence of their charges to leave the room before the conference was over. And having finished reading his text, the critical metaphysician just kept silent. Illusion is not just one of the things we try to protect ourselves from each day. It is also among the various blemishes we need to annihilate, not out of caprice, much less on orders from the Weltgeist, but simply because illusion is complicit in everything, and we are not prepared to forgive the society a single one of its cowardly acts. But if there's any one milieu that has most particularly taken up the position as official janitor of all illusions, even illusions as such, it's indeed the infamous, suffocating, and noxious cultural milieu. In the years to come, it should be expected that domination will more and more authorize art to give the ukases that it couldn't otherwise dress up as truth anymore without being ridiculed. That is something that is somewhat urgent to undermine, before it gets too comfortably engaged. Though people might harbor other, more reprehensible kinds of indifference towards the present production of cultural commodities, this kind is nonetheless probably the most dangerous, for it is our most insidious enemy, operating under cover of insignificance. However repugnant and deeply absurd an idea it would appear to grant even a second's attention to the case of a man who still claims to make art and even literature, the critical metaphysicians felt it would be unacceptable to let the wrong ideas spreading around about the para-Buddhist Xeroxer Michel Houellebecq go on subsisting. This total abortion is certainly especially deserving of our hostility. After all, he was among the first examples of the perfect bloom to proclaim himself publicly as such, and this, beyond all his exaggerated self-adoration, would alone have gotten him a good place on our black list. Equally contributing to that, moreover, is the fact that he is constantly spurting from his putrefied buccal meatus, the adjective metaphysical, and using it as just some unusual synonym for profound or spiritual, all terms which make for excellent marketing gimmicks on the new age consumer's market. But experience has shown us well enough that it is vain to want to do battle with maggots, since the most you can do is crush them. We have no particular complaint against the person Michel Houellebecq, since no person exists. Michel Houellebecq is merely a pseudonym for nothingness. On the other hand, it was left up to Tiqqun itself, and as well to the efforts of the critical metaphysicians, to draw attention to the brutal outbursts of the language of flattery that the Hollaback's appearance on the surface of publicity gave rise to in the cultural milieu. The fact that in this matter we saw the journalist opinion makers denounce the dictatorship of self-righteousness, and large publishing houses opine that one of its writer clerks had been the victim of shopkeepers, and that the clerk in question, though unanimously praised by the puppet critics, had complained about his being persecuted, in the end, which is a question of difference in degree, from the normal self-serving Confucianism of the publishing industry. What is not so typical, on the other hand, is a consciousness with which everyone took their role-playing to the limit, enthusiasts and detractors alike, in faking a passion about it. The era of false absolutes in which the different gestures involved in the literary comeback event, which is how the various press organizations announced it, complying with the Flammarians' instructions, took place objectively, cried out for us to disturb the course of events a bit, while being careful to never let ourselves fall into the trap of being propelled into the stage. When the spectacle is impudent enough to try to glad hand the masses, that's what it's exposing itself to. It wasn't a smart move for them to try to promote their trash in a public space like FNAC, as they did on the Saturday afternoon of October 24th, 1998. Above all, because it's a delicate matter when the spectacle has to explain to its consumers that it's fed them false advertising about its commodities, while assuring them that it won't do any good to complain about it anyway. And so it was not without discomfort that Michel Houellebecq went down to the FNAC that day to confess his point of view. What he said was basically, sure, the book was sold and bought on the pretext that it supposedly passed judgment on society and civilization, that is, on the pretext of its political nature, and for the critical element it contained. But that wasn't really the author's concern, since after all he's just another producer of cultural commodities like any other, who happened to have decided to exploit the quite promising opportunity that the death of ideologies, this is the euphemism people use to designate hostility towards thought, has given to bastards like him. And sufficiently trained in the proper use of the language of flattery, the high school kids that happened to be there saw that as a glaring impropriety and didn't understand why not drawing the consequences of what you write nevertheless had to be called literature. Once he'd acknowledged to them all that he was a worm, they let him know that they considered him to be more like a buffoon. In a word, the Houellebecq didn't manage to render his shame less shameful by offering it up to publicity, for the kids that were there at least. As for the critical metaphysicians, they began by distributing a tract, which we reproduce here. Michel Houellebecq, Biographical Note, an excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Redemptions, 24th Revised Edition, Paris, 2074, translated from the future Latin. Author and know-it-all, born in 1958 on Réunion Island, then a province of France. We know very little about what he did or what he was, since the newspapers, which set the era standards for the literary genre, have all but disappeared in the course of the great conflicts that local historians are today dedicating their efforts to taking an inventory of. None of his works has survived, even in fragmentary form. We have no direct witnesses of his person, but it seems that none of those that he called his friends, in the very strange sense that the era understood the word, considered it worthwhile to pay any homage to him. At most, we have a short-lived wave of insults from the years 2004 to 2005, which either transparently or just plausibly alluded to this obscure personage, among which we have Houellebecq for brains, supermarket taxidermist, visionary little lapdog, or the classic Houellebecq's your mom. It appears, however, that over a number of years he enjoyed a certain notoriety, difficult to explain today, and was a subject of a mass of polemic arguments. One way or another, it is mostly from these that we draw the majority of what information is left about this person and his ideas. Thus, we find in the archives of the imaginary party, entry number H.492-B-58, a tract entitled Michel Houellebecq, Biographical Note, as well as a text from number 2 of the historical magazine Tiqqun, with the title Function of the Houellebecq. From these documents we derive a large number of elements whose comprehension would require a deep knowledge of the sinister Anthracite age, which lasted from 1990 to 2005. It should not be forgotten that the Houellebecq era was the backdrop of a formidable social regression in all the territories which, at the time, was called developed, and in all domains. A chronicler of those times thus reports that the confusion that reigned then even gave rise to the formation of a scientist, pro-state revolutionary party, headed by the mysterious character named Jean-Paul Bourdieu. Commodity society had long before given its last gasp, and was, at the time, only surviving thanks to an ever more glaring, ferocious, and spastic tyranny. Since this order with no more justification couldn't defer the general acknowledgement of its bankruptcy, it needed to develop a kind of language where recognizing the kind of human suffering it engendered wouldn't imply any kind of a project of liberation from it, but where it would simply be condemned and then put at the service of another new modernization of domination. Various concurring sources indicate that there was such thing at the time in these developed societies as a kind of cultural milieu, since there were people around back then who really believed, without laughing, in the existence of a phantasmagoric cultural milieu, and some of them were even demented enough to claim to be part of it, which collaborated in the spread of this language of flattery, which, as we know from the venerable Hegel, knows being for itself as separate from being in itself, or the aims and goal as separate from the truth. In other words, this cultural milieu's impotent expression was an example of such language. In France, the singularly proselyte role of a certain press organ entitled Les Inrecuptibles can be pointed to as an example of this kind of disaster aesthetics, or more precisely, an aestheticization of disaster. It appears that it was said cultural milieu's special assignment to carry out this kind of underhanded repression. Their concrete use of language, symbols, and thought within the modes of production had the effect of reducing literature and art in general to a sadly ridiculous, showy, and weak-willed form of social activity, and they seem to have prided themselves on being cut off from any effectiveness at all. The most remarkable consequence of this state of things was a massive proletarianization of the whole fringe infatuated with that milieu, a fringe which otherwise was particularly averse to supplying the market with its share of spiritual tranquilizers, mundane topics of conversation, and miscellaneous curios, such as was required by the universal need for entertainment, which was the norm in those times. And so that fringe would go on producing this kind of culture, totally neutralized because it was separate from everything else, with an irresponsible hint of resentment in the face of its own decline. Because it was not merely that the whole of society no longer had more than a gentlemanly indifference to the miserable agitations of the so-called cultural milieu in its futile preoccupations, it was above all that it had disintegrated it, declassed it, left it alone, and basically starved it. It's clear how easy it would be, in such conditions, for a few soulless thugs, a few infamous failures, to want to make a career out of nihilism and drag it out as long as they could. Michel Houellebecq, it appears, was merely just another one of them. In this era of absolute darkness, the function of the Houellebecqs, when we are not talking about the individual person of the above-mentioned Michel, who, after all, we don't know much about, but who appears to have been something rather repugnant, viscous, flaccid, and insignificant, at least according to our sources, was to lift the state of degradations that man was in at the time to the level of philosophia perennis. They contribute to integrating a fragmentary critique of consumption into the dominant discourse of the time, but only in the interest of making that misery out to be something ontological, that is, of excluding from all reflection the idea of any practice that might destroy this curse, and if possible, even exclude the idea itself. They critiqued alienation not in order to work towards its oppression, but towards depression, which, at the time, was the subject of the production of whole industrial sectors. At all points, their business was similar to that of the pitiful Huxley, who would certainly have been forgotten had he not been so superbly put in his place by the super-essential Theodore Weissengrund Adorno. They eternalize all the reified antimonies and all the arbitrary inconsistencies proper to bourgeois thought. Hence the essential thing is not just the fact that in the deceptive choice between the abundance of traditional societies and the cybernetic best of possible worlds, they had chosen the latter. Indeed, the choice itself and its very falsehood are the essential things, as the history of our century has so clearly demonstrated. identically, the important thing wasn't what they said, and everything leads us to believe that they said nothing consistent at all, in the end, but the language they managed to get themselves heard by using. And so the Hollaback chose chimeras for his enemies, i.e., the typical fictions of the bourgeois aberration, the individual, liberalism, sexuality, etc. And for these, above all, it was a question of making people grant an existence to them by their very faith in them. In so doing, the Hollaback offered to the clear conscience of the left the stupefying hypocrisy of which it is impossible to imagine today. It's dreamed of chance to have a few obscure, hollow, and immensely boring debates, not like the good boredom of today that we know and love, but the horrifying boredom of those times, to feast upon with total satisfaction, knowing that the lie would remain intact no matter what. Thus, it gave the most hackneyed commonplaces from the old bourgeois trash heap a sophisticated form and a kind of second youth. Like so many of his contemporaries, he was incapable of imagining that anybody might somehow refuse to be reduced to being either part of the coercive collective system or to being a contingent individual, and refused to imagine any meaning not totally contrary to life, and a consciousness not totally opposed to happiness. In fact, it was a mere matter of sitting at the bedside of domination as it lay dying, soothing it by conjuring up a non-problematic version of reality, and describing society as if it had no contradictions in it, which had just been due to a temporary technological backwardness. Michel Hollaback and his peers did no more than slightly stave off the unavoidable process of Tiqqun. As for us, we'd known for a long while that humanity doesn't have to choose between the totalitarian universal state and individualism. End quote from Saint T.W. Adorno. Too weak to overcome his profoundly ignoble nature, Michel Hollaback, regardless, couldn't even make his objection durably likable. And in the first years of our century, he was swept into the black hole of history, doubtless having judged that nothingness wouldn't let itself be annihilated, but would instead contaminate its enemies. Its real enemies took care to attack it directly, and abandoned it to its insipid decomposition. Legend has it that he died sometime around the year 2017 to 2018, thrown out of the window of a pat-pong whorehouse by an authentic Thai virgin. It is also claimed that the stinking pile of his gangrenous viscera and his broken skeleton were thrown out to that area's famed wandering dogs to nibble on, and that even they didn't want to eat them. That, at least, was the hardly believable doom that was foretold for him by the imaginary party's tract, entitled Michel Hollaback, Biographical Note, dated October 24th, 1998. A Conscious Fraction of the Imaginary Party, October 24th, 1998. The critical metaphysicians didn't need to let the Hollaback blather on for long before realizing a dwarf like him wasn't on their level, and wouldn't be, even if he climbed on the shoulders of his toad of a publisher. So at first, they were just going to limit themselves to verifying whether he still maintained what he told lays incorruptibles, namely that he liked Stalin because he killed lots of anarchists, laughs, a statement which could have just been some kind of vulgar promotional provocation, intended to get a few impotent leftists all worked up, and what he'd written in his epilogue to Valery Solana's Scum Manifesto, quote, in the middle of an unprecedented ideological mess, and in spite of a few Nazi slip-ups, Valery Solanas had the courage to maintain a progressive and reasoned attitude, which was in line with the most noble aspirations of the Western project, man's establishment of absolute technological control over nature, including his own biological nature and evolution. And that's part of working towards the long-term goal of rebuilding a new kind of nature on a basis conforming to moral law. That is, establishing the universal reign of love, period. End quote. What we found, however, was a public comprised of around 100 persons, groveling there to lap up the words of the panicky, bilious little minstrel, talking about how interested he was in freedom, man, meaning, and language, and from the depths of his sophisticated nihilism was trumpeting the advantages of a herd future in an all-encompassing technological dictatorship, something a bit more worthy of us attacking. But this moribund bunch hardly had a chance to react, with even a few imperceptible gelatinous vibrations. when it was insulted with the qualifier amorphous. After we'd shown it the nightmare and the impossibility of such an end of history as that, and asked it whether that was what it wanted, a total silence, a viscid silence of hatred, swept in among the crowd. Finally, a lethargic voice came up from some kind of homunculus lurking in the middle of the room, speculating in a blubbery, resigned tone. Well, one way or another, that's what's going to happen after all. Upon hearing this, the audience, seeing its right to sleep questioned, hastily clamored that we ought to be talking about the book, and only the book. Finally, the privilege of the last word went to a depressing old housewife, around 60 years old, an old bag who devoured novels in the insomnia of her retiree's nullity. Quote, well, I don't know whether I'm amorphous or whatever, myself personally, but I just like to thank Mr. Michel Houellebecq. I just discovered his first novel. Me, I don't care about politics. I read novels from the extreme right. I read novels from the extreme left. I have nothing to do with ideology. For 20 years, I wasn't allowed to read Raymond Abellio. What's important to me is the pleasure of reading, letting myself be swept away by the story, the style, etc. End quote. Clearly, Michel Houellebecq can pride himself on having gotten himself at least some readers that are as much of flightless little creeps as he is. But as fanatically resigned as they are, and as numerous, the Houellebecqs are of no account on the scales of fate, since even in their enthusiastic moments, they side with this dead civilization. Obviously, after there is no lack of stuck-up old loonies from the literary milieu cropping up to take advantage of the situation and churn out a few pages full of stupidity, bleeding, and bad faith in Le Monde. After all, it's perfectly understandable. These days, no one hardly makes any kind of criticism, so of course it makes people talk. Hence, we read about Houellebecq on trial, as if it were the real person and not just his function that was attacked here. A trial presided over by some diabolic, invisible authority, doubtless by this group of youths methodically spread throughout the conference room at the FNAC on October 24th, 1998. The whole thing was related in detail, of course, without the writers being able to resist a reflex to falsify the events and propositions at least a little. But they were careful not to mention the existence of any tract, which could have hinted that the people from the imaginary party were able to engage in discourse articulate enough to shatter the whole old, cracking edifice. Other articles followed, all in the same gallant, hysterical mold, all invariably taking up the defense of Houellebecq against his supposed, yet never named, enemies, as is the rule in the spectacle. They all called everyone's attention to the urgent need to save art and literature from ideological political constraints, even though it's so painfully obvious that on the contrary, it's art that, since it's nothing anymore on its own, is now forced to stick its dirty fingers into the ideological, political. It's only natural that the little decomposed literary milieu chose the moment when cultural commodities show themselves to be the very model of ideological political production to start whimpering and whining, and to cry out in defense of literature's inalienable right to insignificance. O eternal spinelessness of art! Suffice it to say that we are not very surprised at all to receive, in the days following the incident, a variety of overtures coming specifically from that milieu, not the most harebrained of which was an offer to publish us. If the fact that they left it up to Houellebecq to raise a little hell wasn't enough to prove how shipwrecked of a state they're in, that right there should prove their total collapse. But we don't connive with defunct bureaucrats of the mind. Rather, we're proclaiming the dawn of a new kingdom. Already the vermin are trembling, since they know that sooner or later the enormous task of delousing will begin, and that they're just part of the ruins.